Hello, I'm Katerji. Welcome to the Katerji Show. Joining us tonight on this very special show, we are talking to the Wall Street Journal's chief international correspondent, Yaroslav Trofimov. I've got his book actually in the background. You can see Our Enemies Will Vanish. It's a really fascinating book about the early days of the Russo-Ukrainian war, the full-scale invasion. Shall we say, and he's going to come on and talk to us about, I think, developments, really the stuff that's happening right now in Washington is fascinating, and he's got a brilliant insight on all of that. So without further ado, my very special guest, Yaroslav Trofimov. Welcome, Yaroslav. There you go. I just need to unmute you, and you are unmuted. Welcome, Yaroslav. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Great to be back.
Yeah, we're in a very interesting time. There seems to be a bit of flux going on in Washington, at least with regards to policy. There are going to be a lot of people, I know, I can already sense this coming from people on Twitter and so on, that Trump hasn't really changed that much, and there isn't really a great deal going on, and this 50-day period is allowing Putin to strike with more impunity, etc., etc. I know these arguments. We'll try and address them, but from my perspective, there is something different in the way the Trump administration is talking about Ukraine that's happened within the last few weeks, particularly since that last phone call between Trump and Putin. That seemed to indicate a shift for me. That's my perspective. But that's someone who doesn't have that many contacts in DC. Obviously, that's your world. You know so much about that. So could you talk to us a bit about what's been happening with the Trump administration and their shifting position on Ukraine, as it were?
Yeah, great. I think it's a very important topic, and I think we should start with the very beginning with what views about Russia people in the Trump circle had when the administration just came into office at the end of January, and they came believing that.
Oh, I did say this might happen. Sorry, guys. He's back. There we go. Oh, give us a second. Sorry.
I'll be back.
You are back. See, I did say that might happen. Let's go from the top again. Let's start all over. So, the Trump administration, what's going on? Talk to us.
Yeah, so we'll have to look back at what views they held when they came to office at the end of January. And I think the ideas that they had was that peace in Ukraine was within reach because the concessions that they thought Ukraine should make to Putin, in their minds, would be enough. They thought that okay, Ukraine should give up the territories that are already controlled by Russia, should agree to various other steps to maybe not to join NATO, and Putin would kind of bank the victories and agree to cease fire. That was very far from what Putin actually wanted. What Putin wants is the end of Ukraine as an independent state, something that he wanted from the very beginning, since the full-scale invasion began. And so, what the U.S. government started to do, seeing in Zelensky an obstacle to peace, because he was refusing at the time direct talks, he was refusing at the time to agree to ceasefire without guarantees. That was the whole argument in the White House, which ended in such an acrimonious ejection and so much frustration on both sides of the Atlantic. Well, I mean, Trump compelled Zelensky to agree to the ceasefire. He compelled Zelensky to send his ministers to these negotiations in Istanbul with the Russians. There were two rounds in May and in early June. And what transpired there is that the Russians are not ready for peace. The Russians brought a series of demands that were the same demands, or even worse than the demands that they had brought to the very first peace talks, also in Istanbul back in late March 2022. What the Russians wanted was Ukraine to basically withdraw forces and hand over to Russia on the silver plate major cities like Zaporizhia and Kherson, to agree to basically disband 90% of the army, perhaps, and basically turn Ukraine to a colony of Russia. And even for the Trump administration, those demands were outrageous. And I think the realization kicked in soon after because Putin also, in parallel with this process, just rapidly increased the tempo of airstrikes, missile strikes, drone strikes in Kyiv. So all of this together, I think, forced this understanding in the White House that Putin is not ready to do a deal. And then there is a question of what to do. Because I think part of all that was also premised on this idea in many parts of the administration that considering that the main enemy, strategic sort of threat to the U.S. Going forward is China, to do something that they call the reverse Kissinger, that is sort of attempt to split Putin Russia from its Chinese patron and ally, and somehow using Ukraine as a currency, secure that flank. Well, that obviously was not going to work because Putin was very intransigent and would not accept a deal that objectively, could have been sold by Russia as a victory in the war, but he just wanted far too much, even for the Trump administration.
Yeah, listen,
And
so
that's where we are now.
that's exactly what my thinking on this. Like I would say that going into things, if you listen to Trump on the campaign trail, if you listen to the people that he was listening to on foreign policy, they were willing to make sweeping concessions to Russia. The things that Steve Witkoff was saying were really, really alarming here in Kyiv, particularly about basically acknowledging Russian control over these areas, not just de facto but de jure as well, which would completely upend the entire international world order that we've come to rely on since World War II. If states can now just take by force land, then there's nothing stopping states to take land by force. So the fact that it was outlawed in international law has effectively binded some of it's not been a perfect system by any means, but the Trump administration was willing to upend the entire world order to get a peace deal with Putin. And we had Michael Weiss on last week, and he said that Putin was just reckless and stupid. He couldn't see that victory for him because he's so ideological about Ukraine. As you said, he doesn't want Ukraine to exist. He doesn't think Ukraine exists at all. He thinks it's a historical aberration that his legacy will be to undo. And it's very difficult to try and sell that to an American audience, no matter how deep into Trump space you got. So, but again, what do you think triggered the kind of emotional shift in Trump's attitude to this? Because it has seemed like he went from being quite aggressive towards Zelensky to now talking about him and what the Ukrainians are going through in quite, less aggressive terms, shall we say?
Well, I think there are several elements to it. One of this was, he came to the office thinking that Zelensky, as he put it, has no cards. Zelensky is a supplicant, Zelensky is a pawn, Zelensky will do whatever he's told, and Russia has all the cards. So, and then, after Zelensky was kicked out of the White House in late February, Trump realized that the Europeans are very serious, at least some of them, about supporting Ukraine. There was a massive backlash in Europe, a massive show of solidarity, and a commitment by Germany, for example, to dramatically increase its military spending to help Ukraine. And at the same time, the Ukrainian army didn't fold. I mean, it's been almost half a year since then, and the Russian territorial gains were minimal, despite kind of a freeze in American supplies since then, because very little American military aid actually comes to Ukraine now. And Zelensky showed that he has some cards, but also, things like Operation Spiderweb, in which several Russian strategic bombers were destroyed at 3 air bases across Russia. I think you're muted again, Oz.
I said he seemed quite impressed by that, didn't he? He seemed like it was an impressive act, right?
Yeah, and at the same time, as you mentioned, he kept sending his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, to Moscow, who was coming away, from meetings with Putin and kind of parroting Putin's line and putting it directly into the Trump's ear. but at the end of the day, once these negotiations happened, and it was clear, it was empirical proof that Putin is not interested in any deal, and at the same time, the civilian toll in Ukraine continued to mount. I mean, I think this played a big role in undermining, the value of this, messages from Putin. And I think at the same time, NATO and the NATO summit played a big role as well. I think people like the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, I think they found a way of speaking to Trump, uh, and Trump respects money. So when Germany, which has money, said it will pay, it was important. And I don't know. I was at the Hague summit of NATO last month, and I think there was also a very important emotional moment because right after the meeting with Zelensky, which was their the second meeting since the debacle in the White House. So that one meeting in the Vatican, one on one, and then another meeting in the Hague without press, avoiding any risks of another incident for the cameras. And so Trump was asked by a Ukrainian journalist, Miroslava Petsa, why don't you give us patriots? Why don't you provide us with this defenses against the Russian missiles? And he showed it's like very, unexpected human empathy in talking to her, because I think, you know, the way Trump operates is that he usually associates countries with their leaders. So, for him, Ukraine was Zelensky, and he even talks this way, like I talked today to Ukraine, to France, to Russia, to Japan, whatever. And so suddenly, seeing Ukraine from a different perspective, we're talking to a woman, a journalist, he asks her, where are your children? She said, my children are in Poland. And is your husband in Ukraine? Yes. And what is he doing? Is he in the army? Yes, he's in the army. He said, oh, it's so tough. Yes, I'll think about it. We don't have enough patriots, but we'll try to find a solution. And I think this human connection was very important in his decision making. Obviously, it's one of the factors, but I think it was a moment when he saw Ukrainians as something other than Zelensky, with whom he has a difficult relationship. And so now we're at the point where American weapons are flowing, and it doesn't matter that much who pays for them. I mean, what matters is the priority that Ukraine has in acquisitions, because the line to buy patriots is 10 years long. And so what the Pentagon did, kind of without telling Trump, in the first days after this NATO summit, was to push Ukraine all the way down, this line, and prioritize domestic replenishment and allies in the Asia Pacific. So now, once again, Ukraine doesn't have to wait 10 years for its patriots. It has priority for those weapons that the Europeans are supposed to be buying, and I think this age of trying to realign global politics by somehow aligning himself with Russia is that window is closed, and you can see this in the commentary in Russia itself, where all his hopes and expectations for his new Russian-American bond against Europe looked dashed now. And I've been reading articles in the Russian think tank sphere the last few days, and the tone is that, well, we have to be prepared for an escalation. We have to be prepared for a downturn in relations with the US, and the only thing we need to do is just to keep going with the war, because one day Ukraine will collapse no matter what. And I think that's the line in Russia right now. And you muted again.
So we saw the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte. He was talking to Trump, and they were talking about that second round of negotiations. I last spoke to you, had you on my show, my podcast. This is not a drill, and we were talking about those negotiations that were included in your book. That round of talks in Istanbul. Trump comes in. He says we're going to have a new round of talks. Tell us about the inside story of those talks. Talk us through, from the beginning of those talks to the end, how they unfolded, how the Ukrainians acted, who the Russians sent. Prime us in the same way, because the talks in Istanbul the first time around, they got a lot more press than this time, than the recent one, because it was much less important a negotiation from the Russians at that point. They seemed to me to be sending a very junior delegation that really had even more insane demands than they had the first time round. So could you tell us a little
Well,
bit about?
actually, yeah, I mean, it's the same people on both sides now and then. So, the Ukrainians started the negotiations with Russia in the very first week of the war, when the Russian tanks were on the outskirts of Kyiv. And the talks were in Belarus, in Gomel. And so, a Ukrainian delegation, including the defense minister until today, Rustem Umerov, including several other key leaders of Ukraine, traveled through Poland to Belarus and met the Russians. And the Russian delegation was led by Vladimir Medinsky, who is a former culture minister. He's a historian, and he's kind of this Ukraine whisperer to Trump. To Putin, uh, who really is, I think, is behind this entire idea that Ukraine does not exist and that it's all Russia. And he's rumored to be the author of that famous essay that Putin wrote before the war on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, the essay that was read to every Russian soldier, that really was the ideological justification for the full-scale invasion. And so, at these first talks in Belarus, the Russians basically demanded a quick capitulation and surrender. Ukrainians should hand over their weapons, have a new puppet government, rename their streets. So any street named after, Mazepa, the hero of the Ukrainian resistance against the Russian, imperialism in the 18th century, should be changed to its Soviet name, all that kind of stuff. Then, once the delegations met in Istanbul at the end of March 2022 for a much more serious round of talks, the situation in the battlefield changed. That was exactly the week when the Ukrainians broke the siege of Kyiv, defeated the Russian army around Kyiv, and started driving Russian forces out of cities like Bucha and Irpin on the Kyiv outskirts. And again, the Russian delegation was led by Vladimir Medinsky, the deputy minister of defense. Frolov was there too. And the Ukrainian delegation again had Rustem Umerov as one of its top members. And the Russian demand there was, Ukraine should curb its military. I mean, the number that the Russians demanded was about 100,000 soldiers, down from 1 million. Ukraine should not have access to long-range weapons. Should be strict limits on how many tanks and howitzers it has. And Ukraine, any security guarantees to Ukraine should, by any foreign country, should come with the Russian veto, kind of basically rendering them completely meaningless. And there were all the other provisions that basically curtailed Ukraine's ability to function as an independent state. It was an agreement of defeat, except it came at a time where Ukraine actually turned back the time of the war and was not defeated. And so obviously Ukraine refused to sign it, especially as in the coming days, the atrocities in Bucha came to light, and where several hundred Ukrainian civilians were executed by the Russian troops. And the Ukrainian army showed its ability to actually defeat the Russians and regain a very large part of the country that had been occupied. And so after that, there were no talks. After that, there were at least no talks on the substance of peace. There were negotiations about prisoner exchanges, about shipping in the Red Sea, in the Black Sea. But Zelensky at the time said, we will not talk to the Russians until they withdraw from all our territories and until we have accountability for the war crimes they've committed. And that was his position until Trump forced him to authorize this second Istanbul in May and June this year.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that you would hear from the American right was that Zelensky wasn't willing to budge on anything, and actually he showed a lot of flexibility. As you said at the start of the show, he conceded on a ceasefire, he conceded on all sorts of things to try and, But from my perspective, and I think I know a few people in Kyiv who will say that the Zelensky approach was not to agree with Trump on all of these things necessarily, but to demonstrate just how Putin was, and in a weird way. And I don't want to make it sound like that I'm equivocating between their approaches, but the Obama approach and the Merkel approach and the approach to trying to give Putin what he wanted from 2014 onwards to try and bring a resolution to what was happening in Ukraine, it has similarities with Trump sort of basically trying to appease Putin until it gets to a point where he can no longer give him any more than he's already offered, right? That line was different for different presidents, obviously, but has Putin squandered an opportunity to pry some sort of victory out of this?
Well, I think you're a bit too charitable on Obama. Obama's position is we don't care about Ukraine, as he famously said, quote unquote. There is nothing the U.S. can ever do to prevent the Russian takeover of Ukraine. And he was very happy to do business with Putin on things like the Iranian nuclear deal
and Syria.
He basically turned he turned his back on Ukraine and refused any lethal aid. It was only President Trump in his first term that actually authorized it.
That's correct.
Merkel is also, she wanted to do business. She wanted, the gas pipelines. And again, she did not see Ukraine's security as a national interest for Germany, unlike the current German government. With Trump, it's much more transactional. And I think, I don't think he was seeking to appease Putin. He was seeking a deal that to his mind was more or less fair. He said, okay, well, the Russians lost, so many people to gain this land. And you talked earlier about international law. Well, I mean, Trump doesn't believe in international law. The Trump administration recognized the Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, that Israel also seized by force from Syria. Something the Europeans have not done. He's speaking openly about seizing Greenland. So it's not like he really believes in all these niceties of the, what people call the rules-based international order, but he recognizes realities on the ground. And I think the Russian demand in Istanbul this time that Ukraine should voluntarily evacuate, a major chunk of territory, about a Taiwan-sized, or I think 3 or 4 Lebanon sizes of land, including the city of Kherson, including the city of Zaporizhia, a major industrial center, including, in the northern part of the Donbass, just as a precondition for a ceasefire. Obviously, I think that was unpalatable even for Trump, because it's just unrealistic, and which Ukrainian government would do that and not collapse the next day, unless you do have Russian tanks in Kyiv again. So these were the demands for a nation that had been defeated in war, and Ukraine has not been defeated in war. The Russians have been on the offensive for the last 2 years and change, and they lost hundreds of thousands of troops, and they gained less than 1% of Ukraine at that time, and no major city. And we're not seeing any breakthroughs. The city of Pokrovsk, which is in great danger now, but they were apparently on the verge of taking it this time last year, and they still haven't taken it.
Yeah, I remember those reports about Pokrovsk and how long they've been going on. The Russians are pressing and they are taking incremental bits of land, but at such a slow pace that it would take them decades to advance across the amount of territory they were asking Ukraine to voluntarily. And again, you're correct. It would collapse any Ukrainian government, and that's something that again is taken for granted by the American right, the sort of the anti-Ukrainian sort of populist American right, who don't seem to understand that this is a democracy where people have a right to choose, and they will. Zelensky wouldn't survive giving away Zaporizhia or Kherson. To the Russians.
Nobody would. But also, I think there was talk very briefly after this the horrors in the White House about how the U.S. wants to replace Zelensky, and there were parts of the administration that were really talking about how he's an obstacle to peace. But the
Lindsey
result of
Graham
that,
as well said that, didn't he?
yes, briefly, yes, but there is the net result of that talk was a surge in the population, in the popularity of Zelensky, because despite all the warts and all, and with all his problems, the last thing Ukrainians want is the Americans to decide who the president will be. And we've seen the same dynamic in Canada, where the Liberal Party that was apparently doomed, suddenly surged back to power because of President Trump's demands that Canada become the 51st state.
Yeah, it's it's an interesting dynamic that those the attacks on Zelensky sort of had a rallying effect. I interviewed Ukrainian parliamentarians in the opposition, and they were all like, look, whatever my criticisms of Zelensky, all of this talk about elections or whatever, it's not true. It's not what we want. We're not pushing for it. We support the government in trying to rid the country of the Russian invaders. And once that has happened, once we can reach a period of stability, then we can talk about political change. So Zelensky seems much more firm in his position, and that political dynamic, the sort of diplomacy that Zelensky had been pushing for, angling for with Washington, has started to pay off for the Ukrainian. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but I wanted to just kind of focus in on the Russian side here. Again, they had an opportunity here to achieve things, victories that the Biden administration certainly wouldn't have given them. What do you think is the driving force behind Putin not being able to accept enough? Because again, they're not just talking about those four areas now; they're also regions. They're talking about going further, and Putin is threatening Sumy and other parts of Ukraine. There seems to be no limit to Russia's sort of territorial ambitions in Ukraine. But I don't know where that misplaced belief that they think they're going to, the proof is they haven't been able to march across Ukraine for 3 years now. But the Russians, Moscow, the Kremlin doesn't seem to have figured that out yet. They seem intent on occupying, pretty much all of Ukraine, as it sounds from their propagandists anyway.
Yeah. So obviously, I mean, the threat in Istanbul was like, if you don't agree to give us the four regions, there'll be 5 or 6 on the table next time. And I mean, the Russians do want to get Odessa, and they want to get Sumy, and maybe Kharkiv and Dnipro and Kiev too, if they can. I mean, so far they're still battling for Pokrovsk, as we know, for more than a year. I think the fear I often heard in the Biden White House last year was this: the Russians will come to Trump and say, "Okay, well, let's freeze the conflict. We keep what we have. You lift sanctions. You stop sending weapons to Ukraine." And there'll be a ceasefire, and then 2 or 3 years down the line, the Russian army will be strong. Ukraine will have no backers, and it will go for it again. And that was a deal that Trump would probably have taken, and that was a deal that would have been a very bad deal for Ukraine, because it would have enabled, would have basically rendered it defenseless, relatively defenseless for the next round, because obviously, after this kind of a deal, there would be an internal crisis. There would be, again, Zelensky's popularity would tank. There would be all sorts of mayhem, economic collapse, perhaps because of the uncertainty, etc. So instead, Putin, I think he made a very big miscalculation, because I think he thought that he could really get all of Ukraine, or he thought that basically. The Ukrainian army would crumble. B, that the American help in military assistance would stop, and that hasn't happened. And so, despite all the celebrations in Moscow after Zelensky's being ejected from the White House, and also the Europeans really started to step in. So now we have this new reality where the Russians are trying to figure out what to do. But they have options also. So they have North Korea, which is supplying them with a large amount of weapons, and they have China. It's not sending the weapons, but it is a backstop economically, politically, and it's supplying the Russian military industry with what it needs to keep making very large numbers of missiles and drones that are sowing terror in Ukrainian cities. But
Now,
there is no strategy. I mean, the thing is that if you look at what's happening, right? So they keep trying different things, different years, and none of them seem to work. First year they tried to bomb the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. All these dreams that plunge Ukraine into a blackout, make them die of infectious diseases because they will have no water and no sewage. Okay, the Ukrainians managed to keep the lights on despite all that, so they stopped doing that. Then now, the new thing is that they're trying to bomb recruitment centers, thinking that the Ukrainians will be able to recruit soldiers, and they're bombing the city of Kyiv, especially because they think that this will somehow provoke a revolt against Zelensky, but it's obviously having the opposite effect. And I mean, the Ukrainian defense industry is functioning despite all its attacks. It's dispersed. It's hidden, and I mean, Ukrainian production now accounts for 40% of the weapons that Ukraine uses in the battlefield, and about 60% of Russian casualties are caused by drones, almost all of which are Ukrainian.
so let's talk a bit about Ukraine's domestic industry, because that really is the big thing that Ukraine, for all the criticisms of things that Ukraine has done badly in the war, building up its domestic defense industry has been one of its key successes, and it's also a global innovator. I would say it's one of the leading countries that has, for example, a naval drone program. I can think of very few countries that have anything close to the capabilities that Ukraine has and has developed on its own. And it has used these to great effect. Now, one of the things that Zelensky has spent a lot of time talking about and working with on the Germans, especially, is building up the drone production, but specialized drones. They're talking about drone interceptors that are used to shoot down other drones because of the cost involved in air defenses, that they really want to save those Patriot interceptors for cruise missiles, the kinds that hypersonic missiles, things that move very quickly across the Ukrainian sky, to allow smaller systems, less advanced, less expensive systems to deal with this drone threat. And that drone threat has been escalating. A few months ago it was 300 drones a night. Then it was 400, then 500, 600. It's hit 700 plus drones a night. And I am expecting that, by August, September, we will see 800, 900 drones. This seems to be the Russian strategy at the moment, saturating the Ukrainian skies. It's been a quite unpleasant experience living here. And as you said about the energy industry, I will say we have started having blackouts in Kyiv again. The last 3 or 4 days, I've had rolling blackouts here in Kyiv. So it's not been a big deal made of it, but I do think that the energy infrastructure is still clearly strained by those attacks. But making life uninhabitable or unlivable for Ukrainians hasn't had the desired effect on for Russia. They haven't been able to destabilize the country politically in the way that they have. So talk to us about Ukraine's defensive plans going forward for the next few years, because we understand that American weapons might come, but I don't think it's going to be as large as that Biden sort of 80 billion. And building its domestic production capabilities, particularly artillery shells, drones, seems to be the Ukrainian strategy long term now, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, Zelensky just today, he spoke about how he needs to bring domestic production from 40 to 50% of Ukrainian battlefield needs. And as you rightly said, Ukraine is a global leader in modern warfare. There are two countries in the world that know how to fight a peer-to-peer or near-peer modern war. It's Ukraine and Russia. With the American military hasn't fought this kind of war since World War II against an enemy of comparable, firepower. And the drone innovation happens, every few weeks. That's why American-made drones, European-made drones literally work in the Ukrainian battlefields, because it's a system that is fixed, and the Russians find solutions to it, and then doesn't work anymore. Well, the Ukrainian manufacturers bring it back to the factory and rewire it and tamper with it. It's this, and we have gone just in this past year, from almost zero drones that are using fiber optics to, that being the dominant kind of drone used tactically in the battlefield. And the fact that a lot of the conventional weaponry in the Russian arsenal is now gone. Russian stock of tanks and heavy infantry fighting vehicles is much reduced, so it's almost never used now, very rarely used in the battlefield. And they had to change their tactics, so they now operate in small groups, sometimes on motorcycles, which allows them to infiltrate villages one by one very slowly, despite the drones, but it makes it impossible to have this sort of combined warfare, mechanized, battalion strength breakthroughs.
It's a jihadist approach. It's genuinely just a jihadist approach to warfare that Russia's having to adopt, because they've burned through their entire Soviet stockpile of armor, effectively, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so Ukraine makes that. Ukraine makes artillery. The Bogdana production is now dozens of self-propelled howitzers a month, which is amazing. Artillery as well. But all this is a land war, right? So we have this conventional slow-moving trench warfare component, in which the Ukrainian disadvantage in manpower is offset partially by the ability to better deploy drones and to thwart the Russian offenses. And then we have this separate component. We have the air war, which is a whole different war, and in which the Russians have an advantage because they have a lot of cruise and ballistic missiles, and the Ukrainians will never have enough air defenses for this, just because they don't exist. If you look at the numbers, the production of the Patriot interceptors, the PAC-3, is about 500 a year last year. You need 2, maybe 3 of these to intercept one Kinzhal or one Iskander ballistic missile. Russia fires several of these every day, and obviously not all of the Patriot production goes to Ukraine. Only a fraction does. So I think the Ukrainians are working really hard on the Ukrainian ballistic missile program. It's rumored to be near its completion, but we haven't seen any actual evidence of it yet. But it's Zelensky's top priority. He keeps talking about this. And the idea behind this is that the Russian air war on Ukraine will only stop when Ukraine is able to hit deep inside Russia and create the deterrence, though it has created with naval drones and missiles in the Black Sea, where through attacking Russian targets, it allowed the reopening of the port of Odessa to international shipping. And so I think it's really interesting, because yes, it's true that Russia is firing hundreds of drones, and Ukraine also has been firing upwards of 400 or 500 drones at some nights this last couple of months at the Russian defense industries, particularly because what they're trying to do is to destroy the Russian ability to make these missiles and drones. So they're hitting every factory up and down the supply chain, from the factories making fuel to paint, to bodies, to navigation systems, to the warheads, to the to propellant.
Now, I wanted to talk to you about the domestic ballistic missile program, because that is a fascinating one. Now, there was a change in government in Germany recently, and the Germans had been hesitant to send the Taurus to Ukraine. The new German government seemed like they were much more willing. However, there's been they haven't agreed to send the Taurus. However, there has been talk that the Germans and it's very open talk, it's not hidden, that the Germans and the Ukrainians are cooperating on a long-range missile program of some kind. Are the Germans effectively giving over Taurus technology to the Ukrainians and helping them build a cruise missile of similar variety? And again, are they working on this ballistic missile with them as well? Do we know much more about what exactly the Germans are helping with regards to this advanced missile program?
I think that's a very optimistic reading. I think there is cooperation on long range weapons, but I think what they're working on is better, faster, possibly reactive powered drones, but nothing like building the Tauruses in Ukraine, which is a very sophisticated missile, of which the Germans have very few, and which the past and current German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, has said will not be sent to Ukraine. So I think Ukraine will probably never see them as long as this war goes on. We'll see what the U.S. Could provide. The U.S. Has the JASSM missiles. These are missiles that could not be sent to Ukraine before because they require F-16 or other American aircraft to launch them. So they were not on the table, a year or two ago. But they, depending on how decisive Trump gets and how much frustration he will have once his ultimatum to Russia expires, I mean that could certainly be an important argument in the Ukrainian arsenal because those can travel several hundred miles and the problem with drones is the drones are slow, right? So when the Ukraine fires sort of sends drones to hit a Russian airbase, the Russians have several hours notice and the aircraft departs before the drones arrive. And the payload on the drones is pretty small, so it cannot penetrate hardened structures the way missiles do. Which is why Zelensky wants a missile, and he wants a ballistic missile, not a cruise missile, because ballistic missiles travel much faster and are much harder to shoot down. And the Houthis have them. It's not like the Houthi Yemen is an advanced industrial power. It's not that hard to manufacture them, but we haven't seen them in action yet.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's another thing that the US has been very squeamish about long-range capabilities being in the Ukrainians' hands, and the Ukrainian plan is effectively to bypass that by building their own. And the US is going to lose any leverage over, not just this administration, future administrations, once the Ukrainians gain that capability of their own. Again, they're probably not going to be able to put out very many of them. Even Russia's not putting out, hundreds of these at a time. So, they're expensive to make and use and so on. But again, Washington's going to lose a lot of leverage if the Ukrainians are able to strike at will wherever they want inside Russia. Is that going to change much in the kind of equation? It's certainly going to put a lot more Russian logistics chains in danger, surely.
Yeah, well, I think the main goal of that program is to achieve a ceasefire in the air, basically to deter Russia from striking deep inside Ukraine. And that's, it's because, if you look at the Russian economy, right, nobody's paying for the Russian war effort. So that's why for Russia in the Black Sea, it was more important to preserve the ability to export oil through Novorossiysk than to strangle Ukraine to Odessa port. And so at the end of the day, they agreed to desist and to both ports are functioning. And so right now, because the firepower advantage is so much skewed in Russia's favor, the Russians see no need to stop this, and they can absorb the pain that they're receiving from Ukrainian drones, though it's significant. But if Ukraine succeeds in disrupting their defense industries with these drone attacks, perhaps also disrupting civilian air traffic. We've seen that airports in Moscow and St. Petersburg were closed for large periods of time this past month because of Ukrainian drones, creating a collapse of the Russian transportation system. So all these are instruments of leverage, and the U.S. will probably have less leverage if Ukraine has its own weapons. Just as the U.S. has less leverage over Israel because Israel has its own weapon systems. But it will still have a high degree of leverage because of so many other ways in which Ukraine depends on U.S. goodwill, including intelligence sharing, which is we're not talking about this, and it's a capability that doesn't cost much to the U.S. In addition, because it's already there, it's not part of any congressional appropriation, but it's critical because no one else has the sort of data so far that when it's being shared with Ukraine, it's really of vital importance.
So look, at the start of the year, the Ukrainians were, and again, I don't know if this was necessarily a strategy for Donald Trump's ears, but they were talking quite a lot about thinking there was going to be some kind of pause to the war in 2025. Again, I'm not sure whether that was just a strategy because they haven't said anything like that within recent months, right? That was really at the
No.
start of the Trump administration coming in. We're looking at a long war. Certainly for the rest of the Trump administration, this war's going to grind on. What are some of the dynamics that could alter that? And again, you talked about the Ukrainians are angling now for a ceasefire in the air, and effectively they'll try and do that by achieving, major strikes on Russian industry that will disrupt things. And as you said, that civilian airline issue, it's important to note that for the last 3 years, there are no civilian airliners flying in and out of Ukraine. You have to get the train or the car across to get to Ukraine. And it's a vast country. It takes 12 hours to get from the Polish border to Kyiv. So will that have an impact on Russia if they were able to stop civilian airliners flying in and out of Moscow for an extended period of time, bringing the war home to the Russian people? Again, as something that might make people squeamish to hear, but this is the daily reality that Ukrainians are living in. And until the Russians are experiencing what that reality of being at war is, the Ukrainians certainly don't think there's going to be any kind of change in the Russian mentality about the war. So is striking deeper and deeper and harder into Russia now the Ukrainian strategy for trying to force the Russians to try and concede something?
Well, I mean, as a strategy, of course. I mean, Zelensky again just today said, we need to take the war to where it came from, to Russia, and that was also the rationale for the incursion into the Kursk region last year. I think it's been an understanding since the very beginning of it. I remember there was an article by Valery Zaluzhny, who was then the commander of the Ukrainian forces back in September 2022, saying that even if we liberate all of Ukraine, the war will not end as long as Russia retains the ability to strike us with its missiles. So we have to develop the capability to disrupt life inside Russia, to make the war not something that the Russians just see on television. I don't know if Ukraine has been specifically trying to disrupt Russian civil aviation. I think it's just a byproduct of Ukrainian drones flying around and the Russian air defenses being careless. They did shoot down an Azerbaijani liner by mistake not so long ago, and they probably don't want to repeat that experience. But also, I think the Europeans and the Americans are not very keen on the Ukrainians taking on the Russian civil aviation at this stage. And again, we go back to leverage. And so whoever in the Ukrainian government is planning these operations has to listen to this advice. But there are several factors that could force the Russians to stop the war. I mean, one is money. They're only able to go ahead with this because of the windfall of oil revenues that is now shrunk because the oil prices have come down in the last couple of months. And that's how they're still able to meet their recruitment targets. Unlike in Ukraine, where there is a mobilization, in Russia, everybody who's going to the army now is more or less a volunteer. They had a mobilization, a one-off mobilization in September, October 2022, and they haven't done it again because it was very unpopular, and more than 1 million Russian men escaped the country at the time. So as long as they have the money from the oil trade, they can keep going, and they have enough volunteers to sign up. And that's one of the things that Trump says he wants to target with his secondary sanctions, which are a very potent instrument. I mean, there's not much you can do with primary sanctions. I mean, the trade between Russia and the U.S., even before the full-scale invasion, was negligible, and it's almost non-existent now. I think Ukraine now trades more with the U.S. than Russia does, despite a much smaller size of the economy. But Russia is selling its oil to countries like India, like China, and several others in the global south, and Brazil. And what Trump has said he might do is impose sanctions on these countries that buy the Russian oil, the secondary sanctions. And that could really make the Russian oil unattractive to any potential buyers and cause a financial problem and squeeze for Putin, a long-term squeeze. And so that could be a significant strategy if it actually happens. But that's not enough on its own. I think that has to come together with the ability to strike the Russian hinterland, and with sustaining Ukraine's ability to keep the front line more or less stable, which requires weapons.
So projections going forward, not predictions, but should we basically be expecting the war to keep rumbling on throughout throughout the Trump administration at least, and potentially onto the next one? Because at the moment, I don't see any trends towards there being any kind of cessation within the foreseeable, predictable future.
I mean, that's certainly what the Russians are saying. At the meeting in Istanbul, Medinsky, the chief Russian negotiator, said, "Well, if you don't sign on the line now, remember we fought against Sweden for I think he said 27 years, and we won at the end, so we can keep going, especially with China's support." So it's hard to predict because events happen that are unpredictable. Things that are stable stop being stable, but it's a very intense war. So it's even Russia does not have an endless supply of men willing to die for goals that are not very clear. And But also Ukraine, I mean, it is holding land now, but at a great cost. I mean, it's not a guarantee that it will be able to do so, for infinity. So I think the question was always not which army necessarily, but which society crumbles first from within. Right now, both of them, prove to be resilient. Ukraine because it's a democracy, Russia because it has suppressed domestic dissent and managed to impregnate the society with this imperialistic idea that has always been popular. Sort of return to imperial greatness. Uh, so we're not seeing obvious cracks on the surface in either country, but that doesn't mean that there is not something happening beneath the surface that could come out at any time.
So I think, yeah, I'd like to talk about Russia and why. A big question will be, why haven't the Russian population rebelled against Putin? Why aren't there major anti-war protests trying to bring down the government? We've seen it in the Soviet Union. It's not like it's an
Yeah.
unfamiliar thing, and it's not like Russia is significantly more totalitarian today than it was at points when there have been domestic issues inside Russia because of war. So, why is it that the Russian population isn't really, agitating to end the war at the moment? The Ukrainians certainly want the war to end. So it's a very different
Yeah.
trying to talk about, but because the Ukrainians don't want the war to go on, they want it to
Yeah.
end, but they realize that they
Right.
can't stop it. It's not their choice. So really
Yeah.
the question is about the Russian population and why aren't they agitating for the war to end, at least not on favorable terms for the Russians?
Well, I think the Russians would like the war to end on favorable terms to the Russians, which includes the end of Ukraine as a separate nation. That's not something Ukrainians will ever agree to, unless they suffer a catastrophic defeat, which hopefully will not happen. I think there are several points here. In the Soviet Union, in its later stage, sort of talking about the 70s and the 80s, was in a way a freer space than Russia today. People did not get killed. I mean, if you were a dissident, you would, go to the gulag, and then you'd be traded and sent to the West after a few years. So I think the stakes of sort of, people were not being assassinated left and right by the secret police at the time, and I think the penalties for speaking out were probably less severe than they are now because anybody who criticizes anything about the conduct of the war is a criminal, can go to jail for 15 years or more, lose their children, and so on one hand it's much
Strelkov
more
being a good
repressive.
example of that, right? Even as a
Yeah,
pro-war
exactly.
Russian, you're not insulated from that.
Well, I mean, we had this case I think 2 years ago when a girl wrote a pro-peace drawing in school. I think it was elementary school, and her father was arrested and she was put into an orphanage for discrediting the Russian army. So you have this much tighter repression on one hand, but on the other hand, you also have open borders. And so, people in the Soviet Union could not leave, so they had to struggle for a better country. People in Russia who don't like what's going on have left. Millions have left since 2022. They went all over the world. They went to, Georgia, Europe, Serbia, Turkey, Israel, United Arab Emirates, all everywhere, Kazakhstan. And so, this intellectual ferment of rebellions is kind of gone from the country. And third, I think these messages that Ukraine does not exist, are actually very popular messages in Russia. It's not just Putin who invented this. It's a line that goes through the Russian view of the world for centuries, before communism and after communism, and even these sort of shining lights of the Russian intelligentsia, like Joseph Brodsky, Nobel Prize winner, living in the U.S., in the U.S. poet laureate, he wrote a poem on the independence of Ukraine in 1991, saying, I want to spit into the Dnieper River and wish it to flow backwards because it's ungrateful, and he used a slur word for Ukrainians. So, unfortunately, that is not necessarily a minority view in Russia, which explains why this war is popular.
Yeah, again, if you're not familiar with the conflict, you hear that ethnic slur that Russians use for Ukrainians very openly. And it shocked me how often, because again, I've been called that slur, and it's really, it's very clear from my profile that I'm not Ukrainian, but yeah, I am shocked by the amount of explicit racism, sectarianism there is deployed towards Ukrainians in Russian-speaking circles. So look, we're not heading to anything, any kind of resolution to this anytime soon. So what are we heading towards, Yaroslav? What's the future hold for Ukraine going forward?
Well, Ukraine has no choice but to keep resisting, and because of its history. And you mentioned my book that we talked about last year, but I wrote another book called No Country for Love, which is a historical novel kind of based on my grandmother's experience in Ukraine in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And she lived through, the most harrowing episodes in modern history, between famine that killed millions of Ukrainians, a famine that was organized by Moscow as an act of genocide, the Nazi invasion, the Holocaust, the executive Renaissance, in which much of the Ukrainian intellectual elite was killed by Stalin. So all these parts of history, which are, by the way, not known to Russians or disputed by the Russians, they are now part of the Ukrainian identity.
Oh, have I lost you? Sorry.
Are you there?
Yeah, sorry, one second. Sorry. I don't know why that happened. Look, it's an awful situation that.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that all the Ukrainians who are around today, they descend from people like that who lived through that, and they know that return to Russian rule would be a return to more death and to more oppression, this kind of past that the Russians very openly want to recreate. And so the Ukrainians sadly have no choice but to, because no matter how many people die in the front line, more people die in Kyiv or Odessa or Lviv if the Russian troops come there.
Yeah, again, it's a very difficult position that the Ukrainians are forced into. So they see it as an existential struggle, whereas the Russians, they don't see it as an existential struggle. It's more of an imperialist ambition to reunite former Russian territories with the motherland. That's the way they see it. I'm not arguing in their defense, but are the Europeans doing enough to end this at the moment? Because again, there's been a lot of talk about Ukraine ramping up its domestic production. The Europeans have ramped up a little bit, but they're still a long way short of providing Ukraine the kind of support that North Korea has been providing Russia, right? It's almost as if Russia's allies are more currently reliable than Ukraine's in some certain situations.
Well, I mean, South Korea sits on a giant stockpile of weapons that's been making since 1950 for a war that never came. And so it has a lot of spare, obviously. and these are Soviet-compatible weapons. And it's gaining valuable experience now because now North Korean troops, know how to fight a modern war with drones and only against all the NATO technologies. This kind of experience that can use against South Korea one day, maybe not too distant future. I think the Europeans. I mean, we cannot really talk about the Europeans because attitudes in Europe vary dramatically. And I think the most important country, obviously, is Germany. And the German government, under Friedrich Merz, is very conscious of what's happening. And the German military is very conscious. When you talk to the Germans, they will tell you that, in their calendars, 2029 is the year when they think Russia will be strong enough to invade the European Union. And they're working, the entire planning system is geared towards having enough military strength by then to stop the Russians. And so in this thinking, Ukraine is a shield for Europe that is buying time for the other Europeans to prepare for war on their own turf. So the Ukrainians right now are dying to protect, the Poles, the Germans, the Balts, the Scandinavians, you name it. And there is this understanding in lots of these countries that every Russian tank that the Ukrainians destroy is a tank that will not be available to drive into Estonia. Uh, and these are the countries that are spending and then building, and they are also investing in Ukrainian production. I think that I mean, it was very important. I think it was Norway and then Denmark and Sweden were the first to say, well, actually, it makes a lot more sense to give money to Ukrainian defense companies because for this $1 billion invested in Ukraine, we can make, I don't know, 100 howitzers instead of 10. It will make it home. I mean, just roughly because obviously labor costs are much lower in Ukraine and so many other costs. And so, and then you have other countries on the other side of Europe that see this war as very distant and not really touching upon their national interests. Spain, for example, which refused to increase its military spending. A large part of the public opinion in Italy, unfortunately, despite Prime Minister Meloni being quite firmly on Ukraine's side. And then you have countries in Europe that are actually kind of in the Russian camp. You have Hungary, you have increasingly Slovakia. We'll see what will happen in the Czech Republic after the election. Romania very narrowly dodged the bullet. So you have that too. So unfortunately, even I cannot speak about Europe because there is a coalition of European countries that is doing a lot, but the European Union as such is partially paralyzed by this disagreement.
Finally, and if there's any final questions you guys have, please do throw them up in the chat, and we'll try and see if Yaroslav has the time to answer them. The final question I have is about the Americans. Now, we're talking a lot about the Europeans because they're having to pick up the slack from that support that the Biden administration had, which was, we can criticize it, and we have done in the past, but the Trump administration wasn't expected to provide any kind of support when they were first coming in, and now there's been a bit of a change, and there might be 10 billion or so. That's the number I've seen floated around. The Americans can still have a dramatic impact on this war and help the Ukrainians win if they were to invest substantial resources into that. Is there a potential future where that happens, particularly if the Europeans start feeling much more threatened by Russian active measures in, say, the Baltic states or Poland? We have seen attacks by Russia on warehouses, so it's not like the Russians are relenting in their hybrid methods across Europe. The Americans still have a large role to play. Can they change the equation at some point?
I don't know. I mean, there are issues of will and there are issues of capacity. And I mean, the fact is that the American military production, while increasing, is not keeping pace with the expenditure of munitions. And it is true that the stocks of Patriots, the stocks of many other types of munitions like ATACMS are running low. And China is watching its enemies empty its arsenals while producing more and more weapons for a potential war that would eject America from the Pacific, from Asia. And so, it is the Europeans in whose backyard it is all happening who will have to step up more than anyone else. and over long term. Over the short term, yes, there are some systems that only the Americans have right now, uh, but I wouldn't think they would just have enough to enable a Ukrainian victory. Right now, we're talking about preventing Ukrainian defeat, and that they probably do have. But it's too early to talk about victory for Ukraine.
So thanks so much, Yaroslav, for giving us your time. I'm just opening it up if there's any final questions. It's been a really, really insightful. And you said a final word about your book. You said you'd written this new book about your family, well, inspired by your family, but it's a novel, as you said, right?
Right.
That goes through the history of Ukraine. Can you tell us a bit about what inspired you to write that, and maybe where people can buy a copy of it?
Yeah, well, I was actually living in Kabul in 2014 in Afghanistan when the first Russian invasion occurred. And I was really shocked by how little people understood the Ukrainian history because everything people knew about Ukraine, they kind of knew through the Russian eyes because that's where all the scholarship was. And, but yet everyone in Ukraine has grandparents, great grandparents who lived through this, meat grinder of history in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that really created Ukraine as it is today and really motivates the Ukrainian fight. And so, the book is based on my grandmother. So it's a tale of her coming as a young woman to the capital of Ukraine at the time, Kharkiv, full of hopes and aspirations, and then kind of smashing herself against this brutal machine of history as her friends and her love disappear, and she has to survive and manipulate and go through all the tribulations of history to protect the people she loves, and obviously make compromises because nobody could emerge from that period without making compromises that kind of destroy your heart, they destroy who you are. And at the end of the day, this book examines the cost of survival, in this such terrible time in history. So yeah, the book came out in the UK about a year ago. It's now available in paperback at the Little Brown Group. It's also out in the US and it's also out in several languages in French. In September, it's already out in Italy, in Portugal, in the Netherlands. No
What
Country for Love.
what was the title? No Country for Love. That's the title, yeah.
No Country for Love, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Yaroslav. It's been a real pleasure to have you on. We will hope we have you on in the future. Maybe the next time there's another round of negotiations that go nowhere. But we've always really appreciate your insight. And listen, if you aren't familiar with his work, every time there's a scoop in the Wall Street Journal, Yaroslav's name is going to be on it. So, thank you so much for your time. And we really, really appreciate you coming on the Oz Katerji Show. Thank you, Yaroslav.
Thank you, Oz. Great to be on the show.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So that was Yaroslav Trofimov. He was the Wall Street Journal's chief international correspondent. Do check out his book, No Country for Love, and also Our Enemies Will Vanish. I'll put little links to those in the show notes, so you'll be able to check those out. And listen, if you're following live on Twitch, thank you so much, guys. Really appreciated. Thank you to all the regulars who throw up things in the chat. Really appreciate you. Thanks for following on Twitch. We're still trying to build the channel. If you're following on YouTube, watching for the first time, please do like and subscribe. You can see we're still only a small channel, but we do have really cool guests, so we're going to keep trying to bring you those perspectives of people that really understand the specific subjects that they're talking about. And there aren't many people that understand the Russo-Ukrainian war better than Yaroslav, so it's a real honor to have him on the show talking to us through some of what's been going on. Unfortunately, look, it's been a rough couple of weeks here in Ukraine. There's been a lot of bombing. As I said, we've had power cuts again, so that's not good. The Russians are relentlessly bombing parts of the country, so do keep supporting Ukraine. It is a really important thing. That there doesn't look to be any respite. There doesn't look to be any good news on the horizon. The best news that we've heard in a while is that Trump might finally provide some weapons to Ukraine. So that's a really important thing. So thanks. I've been Oz Katerji. This has been the Oz Katerji Show. We're going to keep bringing you these really interesting guests as often as we can. We've got Arash Azizi tomorrow. He's going to be talking to us about the Iran strikes, what's been going on between Israel and Iran, what's currently going on in Iran following those US strikes on the nuclear site. So he's a really fascinating individual. He's done some really, really great work. So do check out his work too. And I look forward to bringing you his perspective on what's going on in Iran tomorrow. Hopefully we're going to do a Syria episode really soon, because obviously there's a lot of developments happening there that we want to talk about. So listen, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Liquid Amber. Thank you, A Random Shot in the Dark. Really appreciate all the regulars that keep the show going. And yeah, please do follow along, hit that like and subscribe and follow button. That really helps us out. And I will see you on the next show. Thank you. I've been Oz Katerji, and this has been the Oz Katerji Show. Good night.